week, you'll have a handout to put in your book. Okay, has everybody got a notebook? How are we doing? Did we run out?
We got 3 more.
3? Gary needs one.
Gary doesn't need one.
He hasn't memorized. Great. So we'll get some more set up for next week. Well, thanks for coming. This was an idea that was mentioned about a year ago, saying, I just really think I need to know the basics. So we don't want to insult anyone by telling you stuff you already know. But we're going to assume in our presentations that this is the first time you've opened the Bible. And the idea is that I'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 15, 20 minutes for conversation. But if you have a question in the meantime, feel free to interrupt. So we're calling this Bible 101. If you know somebody who wants to start with us next week or any time in the next several months, we'll be able to catch them up. We'll try to keep the notebooks current with what's coming.
Jim,
Yeah.
where do these pages go?
You can just put them right after that first page. So tonight, I get to be Bible Basics syllabus guy. Remember that first day of class when you got the syllabus and you thought, I'm going to die before this is all done? So I get to be the syllabus guy. And next week, though, we start into the meat of it, and I've given Greg McClellan one of the hardest topics. He is going to do a 30,000-foot view of Genesis 1 through 11. That is the first of 2 creation stories through the flood. And he's gonna through the Tower of Babel. Through the Tower of Babel.
DVD. Really? Come on.
Well, don't use all your material now. You want anything left. So he's coming next week, and then Don Kronk is coming in, Daryl's coming in, and then March 11 through April the 1st, we're taking a break. And Jim Hunter, Dr. Jim Hunter with a PhD in church history, you know, when you have a talent like that around, you want to take advantage of it all you can. I've asked him to summarize 1,000 years of Christian history in 4 nights. And you know Jim, it'll be fun. Whatever it is, and I promise you'll learn something every night you'd not heard before, except maybe Gary. Or Daryl, he's had enough church history classes. Well, anyway, a few of us. And then we're actually scheduled all the way through to August. So come when you can, and we'll try to save some handouts when you can't make it. So the first place I want you to start is with this really pretty chart that I plagiarized from a website, which is why it's not really clear. But if you've never opened the Bible before, you may not know that there are some automatic divisions. The Old Testament is made up of 39 books, and a book is how we talk about these different writings. And each book will have a unique theme and unique subject matter, and most of them will have different authors. So just in case there was any part of you that said, I wonder who wrote the Bible, the answer is a whole bunch of people wrote the Bible. And a whole bunch of people helped edit the Bible into the form we have now. So most of the Old Testament books will not be by a single author, but will be fragments that were collected by an editor. And in just a minute, we'll talk about when they came into the form, more or less, than we have them now. New Testament's a little different. It has 27 books, and most of them are single authors with very little editing. Old Testament, heavy editing. New Testament, not so much. Now, the stories of the Old Testament go back about 2,500 years. But the stories were passed from generation to generation to generation orally, long before they were written down. These stories were transmitted from parents to children and transmitted faithfully. I'm pretty confident the stories came more or less the way we've received them. But then there are some places where they are merged. For example, and I'm going to steal some of Greg's thunder here. Chapter 1 of Genesis comes from a unique tradition with a unique set of words, language. Chapter 2 is another creation story that comes from a different source using different words than chapter 1. Now, in English, we read the word Lord or God, but in Hebrew, they're coming from two very different places, and an editor put those two chapters together into the book of Genesis. That explains why chapter 1, story of creation, is different from chapter 2, story of creation. When you get to the flood story, in one chapter it says that Noah took 2 of every animal. In the next chapter it says Noah took 7 of every animal. Was Noah really bad at counting? You know, maybe that's what happened. Or it's different oral traditions that were merged into one piece of writing. Does that make sense? So in the Old Testament, we have 5 books of the law. If you want to use your pen and write next to law the word Torah, Torah. And when the Jews talk about studying Torah, they mean Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The other name for that is called the Pentateuch, P-E-N-T-A, 5, T-E-U-C-H, Pentateuch. So those law, Pentateuch, and Torah are all used interchangeably in biblical literature. And then we have 12 books that are history books. Starting with Joshua, and I think Darrell gets Joshua. Don't you, Darrell?
Joshua and Judges, I think.
Joshua and Judges. And so the books of Old Testament history. And then you have, according to this list, 5 books of poetry. And while it's true that it's poetry, it's also called, except for the Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, is called the wisdom literature. So if you want to write that next to, it's an entire body of Old Testament research called the wisdom literature. The rest of the Old Testament are the prophets. And the major prophets were those who were aged 21 and over when they wrote the book. No, that's not true at all. The major prophets are longer. How is that? How simple can that be? Minor prophets are short little books, 2 to 6 chapters. The major prophets are longer books, 40, 50 chapters. The only difference between them is that some of them are longer than others. And then between the book of Malachi in the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament is a gap. And that gap is about 400 years. That doesn't mean that the Jews hibernated and nothing happened. A lot of things happened in that period, but we don't use them in our Bible. Now, if you have Catholic friends or have a Catholic Bible, there will be something in there called the Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha fills in those gaps between Old Testament and New Testament. The early church did not rank the Apocrypha up to the standard of biblical authenticity. Authenticity is not the right word. Quality. Usefulness. But that doesn't mean they're not true, but they're history. Now, Linda White told me that she's reading the Apocrypha right now. If you are a history buff, it's fascinating stuff. But in Protestant world, we've never used the Apocrypha. There's not anything wrong with it. It's just not really valuable to us for doctrine or for study. When we come to the New Testament, and there's some divisions in the New Testament. There are 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were the first rock and roll band. That's not true either. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you want to draw a circle around those 3, we call those 3 the Synoptic Gospels. S-Y-N-O-P-T-I-C. Synoptic Gospels. And that means that much of their material is duplicated from each other. And when we get to the Gospels, I'm sure whoever has the Gospel night, I don't remember, will tell you that the Gospel of Mark is the oldest and the first. And the way we know that is because large sections of Mark are duplicated verbatim in Matthew and Luke. There's a lot more to that story. It's a fascinating story. When we get there, I'm sure whoever has that night will be able. Is that your? Oh, well, I know you'll get it. If Gary's got that night, he could not help himself not talking about the Synoptic Gospels. I know him, and something that juicy and scholarly, he's not going to be able to ignore it. But the Gospel of John is a horse of a different color. It is totally unrelated to the other 3. It tells the story of Jesus in a very different way, and I won't steal Gary's thunder for that. There is one book of history in the New Testament. It's the Acts of the Apostles. You may be interested to know that Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Same author. And I think he probably meant to produce a 3rd volume, but never got to it or never made it to print. Paul was the first writer in the New Testament. The first books that were written in the New Testament were Paul's letters. And when we say letters, we literally mean letters. You may hear the word epistle, E-P-I-S-T-L-E. It just means letter. If somebody really wants to sound very scholarly, they'll say epistle, but it just means letter. So Paul's writings are the oldest. Before the Gospels were written, Paul was writing to the churches. And then we have Paul's individual letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and I learned when I came to Kentucky that some Kentuckians say Philemon. I'd never heard that before in my life. We said Philemon, but in Lexington they said Philemon. I thought that was crazy. It made me laugh. And then you have, in that far right box, you have letters by others. Hebrews, we don't know the author. And I don't know that I make Hebrews a letter. It's more like a long, very long sermon. But letter is good enough. James, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude. And if I were doing this chart, I would put the Revelation out by itself. It is a letter, but it's a certain kind of literature that's much more like the book of Daniel in the Old Testament and parts of Ezekiel in the Old Testament. It's apocryphal literature. And I don't remember who gets the joy of doing Revelation. Let's see.
You.
Me? Oh, I love the Revelation. I'm glad I got it. So we'll handle the Revelation. Now, when did these books come into this form? This is the handout I gave you tonight. Probably during the days of the monarchy. We think of the monarchy beginning with Saul. And then Saul was replaced by David, and David by his son Solomon. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But this is a handout that will give you just an idea of when these books came into this form. To be honest with you, these books came into this form due to trauma. It started during the Babylonian exile, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And the folks were separated from Jerusalem. And they were very concerned that they were going to lose their sacred teachings. And folks began to collect them during that period of national trauma, and the Bible began to come into the shape in which it is. Now, Gary has the very last night when he's going to tell you how the Bible came to be. And I won't get into that tonight. But just to say, during these days of a lot of trouble, the writings moved from being transmitted orally to being transmitted in written form. And that is for your own personal edification, and if you want to spend some time on that. Now, I want you to go to this chart that says Major Periods of Jerusalem's History. I'll add a few things to this. Before the land of Israel was called Israel, it was called Canaan. C-A-N-A-A-N. And the land of Canaan was a bunch of diverse tribes who were not Jews. It looks like this, what I'm looking at now says Major Periods of Jerusalem's History. Like that. And they were a bunch of tribes who warred against each other, who settled in what we call modern day Israel. And it was there, hey Jay, I'm glad you're getting started early in life. We're going to turn you into a seminary professor. These were the Canaanites. The land really had no central authority. It was a bunch of kingdoms, small kingdoms. Some of these kingdoms no bigger than a city. City-states. Hittites, Anakites, all those, Charles and Linda White, all those ites were living there in the land of Canaan. But Abraham was a man who lived over in modern-day Iraq, who said one God, not the many gods of the Canaanites, one God had said, I want you to leave your home, and I'm going to give you a land that will be your own. And Abraham set out for this brand new land, but the problem was, when he got there, it was already occupied. And it was occupied by the Canaanites, who were really very kind to Abraham, and sold him his first plot of land, sold him a cave in order to bury his wife Sarah at Hebron. Hebron's a marvelous, thriving Palestinian city, and it's the source of significant conflict right now in the Middle East. So that carries us up to about 1200 BC, and we call that the age of the patriarchs. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This was the period of the captivity in Egypt. Part of this time, the Jews were, and they weren't even Jews yet, the Hebrews were over in Egypt for 400 years, and Moses led them out of Egypt. That happened in all of that period of the patriarchs. But we come down to First Temple. You see that on the left. And write the word Solomon next to it. It was King Solomon who built the first temple. And we call this the First Temple period. About 1200 BC. The first temple was built in Jerusalem. Now, you want to write this date in 722. Well, before you do that, write 930 BC. In 930 BC, the nation that had been united under King David, Saul, David, and Solomon, broke apart into two in about 930 BC. And the northern kingdom became Israel, and the southern kingdom became Judah. And we're going to see that in maps here in a minute. The northern kingdom, so write this date on, this is 722. The northern kingdom named Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BC. And all of the Hebrews were deported. 10 of the 12 tribes left and have not been heard from since. Our Mormon friends say they built a boat and they sailed to America. Our Ethiopian friends say that they fled to Ethiopia and took the Ark of the Covenant with them, and the 12 tribes settled in Ethiopia. Those are all kind of goofy. But the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom, southern kingdom called Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. But Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians. And this is the period we call the Babylonian exile. The temple that was built by Solomon in 1200 was destroyed in 586 BC. And now we can call them Jews because they were Judahites. They were of the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, but that's where the Jews got their name. They were carried off to Babylon for about 60 years. The Persians defeated the Babylonians and let the exiles go back home. And so second temple built 516 BC is the temple that was standing in Jesus' day. We call that second temple. So when you're talking to an Old Testament or New Testament person, they may say, well, this is the second temple period. It's the temple that was built when the Jews came back from Babylon. The architect was a man named Zerubbabel. What a great name, Zerubbabel. And the man who rebuilt the walls was a man named Nehemiah. And you may remember Nehemiah and a priest named Ezra reconstituted the worship in the temple. You know, great stories out of the Old Testament. Now the Persians let them go back from Babylon, but they maintained dominance. So this was Persia was in charge of this entire part of the world during those days. Until the Greeks came in 332 BC. The Greeks dominated Jerusalem, this part of the world, and was very abusive to the Jews. It was a very painful time for the Jews. The temple was desecrated by General Antiochus Epiphanes, who slaughtered a pig on the altar in the temple, and the Jews to this day call that event the abomination of desolation. It was a terrible time, but the Persians did allow the Jews to return. The Jews were replaced by the Romans in 63 BC. Basically, the Romans came in to help. Help. We will help you. And before you know it, they've taken over. My oldest son, works for the state of Kentucky, and I have said to him the scariest words in the English language are, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help. And that's exactly what happened. The Romans said, we just want to help. In the meantime, they seized control, and all of us have seen enough pageants to know the Romans were in control at the time of Jesus. The Romans were not displaced until 324 AD, and they were replaced by the Byzantines. You've heard of Constantine the Great. The Byzantines were Christians from the east. Constantinople was called the New Rome, and the dominant world power started in Istanbul, modern-day Istanbul, Constantine the Great. The Byzantines were there until 638, and they built the first big Christian churches, and two of those churches remain, at least partially remain, Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and Church of the Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The Muslims came in 638, and they were there until 1099. At the end of the 600s, the end of the 7th century, they began to build the Dome of the Rock on what Jews and Christians believe was the Temple Mount. And that's a very familiar building. It's in all the pictures of Jerusalem. The Muslims were there until 1099 when the Crusaders, this time Western Christians, European Christians, took control. King Baldwin I, some of those. If you've been watching, I love to watch costume dramas, and there's a bunch of, I think, Orlando Bloom, Kingdom of Heaven, I think. There's one that's a series on History Channel about Crusaders in Jerusalem. It's a fascinating. That all happened in that period. The Muslims returned in 1291 under Saladin the Magnificent, who took control. The Muslims were replaced by the Turks in 1516. The Turks were replaced by the British in 1917. And on a Thursday morning in May of 1948, or November, I have to look it up, November of 1948, the United Nations declared the nation of Israel. And so that's where we are to this date. That is a lot of history in a short amount of time.
Question.
Yeah.
Question. You mentioned all these ancient battles and fightings that went on. Has anyone uncovered any artifacts or battlefield sites that go back that far?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Tons. You probably know that the science of archaeology developed in Israel.
Yeah.
They created it, and they created it for people trying to prove the Bible was real. But that was the foundations of archaeology. And the beginning place of archaeology was where? Do you know? The first place it was done? Kathleen Kenyon.
Right.
In Jericho. Jericho. They were looking for the walls that collapsed in Jericho. Well, they didn't find any walls that collapsed, but they did find the oldest city on earth. Now, go to the maps in the back. And the first map I want to show you is the physical geography of Israel. Because this will help you understand some of what happens. Before we do that, just go to page 15. Go to page 15 first. And I want to show you something. On page 15, tiny little nation of Israel fits right here. Can you see that? It fits right there on that eastern end of the Mediterranean. Tiny little place. Why is that? The only reason Israel is important in world history is because it is the land bridge that allows all of the kingdoms of the world in their time to get around and conquer each other. So in other words, Asia up here, any Asians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians, if they wanted to get to the wealth of Egypt down here on the south, they would have to march their army, and they need to march their army along the coast of Israel. Does that make sense? When the Romans cared nothing about Israel or Judaism. It meant nothing to them. Now, only recently have they found natural resources. They've now found natural gas reserves in Israel. But there was no gold mines, no silver mines, nothing of value except its location in the world was the bridge around how you marched an army from Europe to Asia or to Egypt and all the wealth of Africa. Now go to page 1. The reason I show you that is on page 1, you see that light green coastal plain. That's where you march your army. If you're wanting to get down south over to Egypt and Africa, Ethiopia, and all of the wealth of Egypt, you're going to march your army along that coastal plain. If you are an Egyptian and you want to conquer the Babylonians or the Assyrians, you're going to march up that coastal plain. So that coastal plain is exactly what it sounds like. It's relatively flat. That's the part of that is the plain of Sharon. The Sharon plain, and the rose of Sharon. Do you have a rose of Sharon bush in your that comes from that plain right there, the rose of Sharon, or this Sharon, our rose of Sharon.
Thorns.
And then the middle green is exactly what it sounds like. It's hill country. The further south you go, the closer you are to the desert. And the name for the desert is the Negev. That is the name of that desert. And if you, when you get down there, you're really in open desert, exactly what it sounds like. And you're in for a long, hard haul over to Africa. But that's why you stay along that southern coastline there. Up toward the north, you're getting up to Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is snow-capped. There is a ski lodge on the Israeli side, on the Syrian side, and on the Lebanese side. They all ski in the winter on Mount Hermon. And that's up at the far north. And the water on Mount Hermon, the snow on Mount Hermon melts and flows down the river. And you see that first little tiny body of water, that little tiny one. That's called Lake Hula. They invented a dance there. Very famous for the hula dance that came. That's not true, is it? Lake Hula is a natural aquifer. It is a natural water purification system. And the modern-day Israelis made a mistake, they know, when they took occupation of the Galilee in the 1940s and 50s. They drained Lake Hula and turned it into farmland. They made a huge mistake. They destroyed their own natural aquifer, and now they are in the process of restoring that natural aquifer at Lake Hula. The water flows out of Lake Hula and forms the Sea of Galilee. Jordan River flows out of the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea and goes nowhere because it's the lowest place on earth. The Dead Sea is 7 times saltier than any other body of water on the earth. If you cannot swim, but you want to, come with me in 2 weeks and we will swim at the Dead Sea because you cannot drown.
You float on the top.
You float on the top. You pop like a cork on top of the Dead Sea. Now, I want to show you something else that I think is fascinating, and it is map number 2. Turn the page. The Jordan River, that pink right there in the middle, that is the Rift Valley. And it begins up at the top in the Bekaa Valley. The Bekaa Valley is in Lebanon. The valley comes down through the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea. It comes under the Red Sea, comes on down to Lake Victoria, on down to Eritrea, on down into Africa. So you heard of the Great Rift Valley. That is all part of the system of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. Now go back to page 1. The light brown to the east is Israel has at times occupied that, but does not lay claim to it. It was not part of what was promised to Abraham. It's called the Transjordan. Now Syria is at the top. The nation of Jordan is at the bottom of that. About 2/3 of that is the nation of Jordan. And if you've been reading about the Golan is at, you see that where that green meets the brown there at the top? That little bump right there is the Golan. And that is, the Jews they say we don't own the Golan except that we control the Golan because it's the high point, and we don't want the Syrians to have the Golan because if they do, that gives them a high point in which to shoot rockets into Israel. And so even though Israel does not claim to have ownership of the Golan, they say we have to have it for our own protection. Just recently, the president The United States made a very unilateral decision that the hardline Israelis were very excited about, is to say the Golan belongs to Israel. Interestingly enough, Israel never really said they own the Golan, but it is a defensive, like a DMZ, it's a defensive zone.
I just wonder if that could ever be sorted out for everybody's satisfaction.
Well, I'm going in 2 weeks, I'll sort it
See
out.
if you do, okay.
See what I can, see what I
See if
can.
you do.
Now,
Are you meeting Pompeo over there?
What's that?
Are you meeting Pompeo?
Yeah, General Pompey? Yeah, we might have to have words. Okay, I have just a few minutes left. I knew this was ambitious. And I want to talk to you about Bibles, because some of you may want to purchase a Bible. And look at this chart that says choosing a Bible at the very top here. It's a little misleading when it says types of Bible translations, because not every Bible is a translation. A translation is when a team of scholars takes the Old Testament, Hebrew and Aramaic text of the Old Testament, and the Greek text of the New Testament, and sits down and translates it into whatever language they're translating into. A paraphrase is when someone takes, for example, an English Bible and restates it in more or less colloquial English, everyday common English. This was my Bible as a teenager, and it's abused and written in, and it's called the Living Bible. It is a paraphrase. It's not a translation. Now, there is a new one called the New Living Translation, but the one I used back then was a paraphrase. It's easy to read, and I think it's great. It probably transformed my life as far as my love for the Bible, because all of a sudden I could read the Bible in my language, in modern English of the 1970s. Another very popular one right now is called The Message. I love The Message. It's not a translation. So while these are great for Bible reading, they're really not great for hardcore Bible study, doctrinal conversations. But if you're going to sit down and read, I think these are marvelous. Kelly Lewis, our drummer, carries The Message all the time. Loves The Message, as long as you know what it is. Most of us are a certain age where we grew up with King Jimmy. King James Bible. That's the thees and thines and thous. And I loved it when I was a child. I read it. I have a hard time reading it now. Written or translated by a team of scholars paid by King James the First and the Sixth, the first of England, the sixth of Scotland, because he was trying to unify his country under one Bible. Prior to that, the Bible had only been in English for a couple hundred years. But I grew up with King James, and who still carries a King James? Anybody? You still carry? Yeah. Look at that. The halls carry King James. You carry a King James?
I'm at the New King.
So there is a newer version called the New King James, which kind of smooths out the thous and thines and the lovest, and it kind of smooths all that out. I will quote the King James at funerals. John 14, let not thy heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. I will quote the 23rd Psalm at funerals out of the King James. It's beautiful. There's nothing wrong with it. The problem is that in the last 400 years, the words we use every day in English have changed so much that it almost needs a translator itself. A Bible that I was given in college is a New American Standard, and you'll see it on this chart, NASB, all the way over to the left. one of the most word for word. If you're wanting a Bible that I want to read word for word, well, you don't want word for word because you couldn't make sense of it. It is, if you really want one, look for an interlinear Bible, and it'll have the Greek and the Hebrew on the top and the English word underneath. And if you just read it in order, it'll drive you crazy. Because if you've studied a foreign language, you know that their syntax is not like ours. Their word order. German made me crazy because they don't even say the verb till they get to the end of the sentence. All right, that's not how we do it in English. I think that's how Yoda speaks. I think Yoda speaks German. But New American Standard is a great Bible. We use here in worship the New International. It is first published in '84, and it has been revised 2 or 3 times.
2011.
2011 was the last one. It was first published in '73, '78, '84, and 2011. And this is what we use in worship. It's a good translation, and it's known for its readability. If you want a good translation, I don't think I have one. A good translation that's easy to read is the ESV, English Standard Version. They're very popular, and they're easy to find, and it is well done. Probably if the ESV was available when I came, we probably would have bought ESVs. But we use NIV now. But ESV is a little easier to read in American English. It doesn't read British, it reads American English. Questions about Bibles? Yeah.
Have you ever heard of one called the book?
The book, and I don't know much about it. It is a version.
It came out in 1986, but I have a paperback copy at home. That's why I wondered. It's very easy to read. I mean,
Yeah,
you don't have to focus on.
I have to look at that, what version it is. I think it's an ESV. I want to talk to you about, if you're going to buy a Bible, what it's bound with is important. This is a bonded leather. It is relatively inexpensive. It's fake leather. I think this is. But there are lots of them, and they're pretty good. But if you want a Bible that you're going to use for a long time, you want a full leather Bible. Now, I've had this one rebound because I bought 3 Bibles and took them all back. I didn't like them. I liked my Bible. This is an NIV that I use, and I had it bound. It cost about $100, and I can't do it again because you lose some page size, and it's going to cut into words if I did it again. So this binding is going to have to last a while. So the better the binding, the longer your Bible will last. There are tons of study Bibles. Just remember that if you have a study Bible, it is somebody's opinion. I have been in untold Bible studies when somebody will say, now Bible at the bottom here says, Hosea forecasts that the warfare to come will destroy. And well, that's so the Bible says that. Okay. Read the text of the Bible. The notes at the bottom are just some scholars or preachers. John MacArthur has one. I'm sure Robert Jeffries has one. There's all kinds of study Bibles out there. If you're going to buy a study Bible, these are hardbound. I love this one. It's fairly new. It's a Zondervan. It's an NIV, and it's the Cultural Background Study Bible. Extensive notes, and if you're interested in the social setting of each Bible story, it's fantastic. I love this one. It's falling apart. The Archaeological Study Bible, fascinating. It's another Zondervan, still in print. And you can get, if you're into the archaeology stuff, it'll have archaeology notes. This is one I had years ago called the Disciple Study Bible. It's not in print, but it was a very, very good one produced by Southern Baptist. And it has, you can see it notes at the bottom. If you're choosing a Bible, you may want to look for a red letter Bible. They're very popular, and if you're like me, that sometimes have a hard time finding Bible books, thumb index is a nice feature. And so all those things add prices. And you know me well enough to know, don't you dare buy a Bible that doesn't have maps in it. It's very popular not to put maps in Bibles because they're very expensive to produce. And so I'll pick up Bibles at the bookstore and think, oh, that's a really nice binding, but I'll look at it and there'll be no maps and I have to put it back. Tish?
This may be one of my usual stupid questions, but what I wondered at, are any Bibles available that have these plastic overlays showing what the modern book? In other words, would overlay show what's there today? We used them for wall maps in school.
You mean a map overlay?
Map,
You know, I bet you if you Google it, Amazon it, you probably would find one. If you want a new study Bible, there are called parallel Bibles that will put a passage of the King James and the New International and the Living next to them. And if you really say, what is it? Wonder what it reads in the different. When I'm reading a text, I will read different versions of the Bible to make sense. Now, I want to show you page 6. It says 1 Timothy 3:11 at the top. You need to know that every Bible translation team cannot help it but have a theological bias. They cannot help it. One of the words that is a Greek word is gune, woman or wife. Now you think, well, that's maybe not a big distinction to make. If we go to this verse in the NIV, we'll look at the second one, King James, the second verse 11. This is the passage in 1 Timothy on the role and the responsibilities of the deacon. Verse 11, the second reading, even so must their wives be grave and not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things. Verse 11, above it, the reading, the NIV above it says, in the same way the women. Okay, that's a distinction. Is Paul in 1 Timothy writing about the women deacons? Or is he writing about the wives of the male deacons? And so every translator will come to some text and cannot help but make a choice in their translation for one preference or another. So the only way you're really going to learn it is to know the difference is to learn the Greek or the Hebrew, or get you a bunch of books and start going to town. Does that make sense to you? So every translator is going to come and cannot help but put their own spin on a text. And so if a friend of yours reads the same text differently than you, there might be a reason they might be reading it in another version of the Bible. The Message, look at the bottom. No exceptions are to be made for women. Same qualifications. That would lead you to think these are women deacons. The one above it, I didn't write, the Amplified. Women must likewise be worthy of respect. Now, modern Bibles, not the King James, but modern Bibles will have footnotes where there is a variant. It's called a textual variant. And you can see that I didn't take out in that very top one, in the same way the women, subnote C, if you read to the bottom, it's going to say the word can be women or wives. So a modern translation, away from the King James, is going to give you a footnote that says there is a difference here. For example, in John, the Gospel of John, chapter 8, the story of the woman caught in the act of adultery and brought to Jesus. We now know that in our oldest versions of the Gospel of John, that story does not appear. Jesus is writing in the sand, and he says, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." That story is not in our oldest, most reliable versions of the Gospel. And if you have a newer translation, there'll be a note. That passage will be there, but it will say this story is not in the oldest versions of the Gospel of John. And it helps us as Bible students to say, okay, well, let's kind of understand what that means. It was added. That doesn't mean Jesus didn't say it, but the church added it later. It came along from another direction. Probably John didn't put it in there. The last thing I want to say to you is, everybody says, well, we want to read the original text. Well, I wish you could. It would make our lives a whole lot easier if we had John's first copy. We don't. When Gary gets to the Dead Sea Scrolls the last night, you'll hear about textual variants and biblical versions. And the truth is, we don't have. We have a collection of old manuscripts that scholars have spent hundreds of years poring over these old manuscripts and have come to believe there are some generally accepted things that were original to the text. And Gary follows a group who even draw that down a whole bunch more. Fascinating. He ought to, not on a Wednesday night, but sometime talk to you about that group that he likes to read. He says there's a whole lot less here that's authentic than what we really have. All right, I have gone over my time, but I will take a question or two.
What's the transliteration from the Hebrew characters to the Hebrew to the English?
A transliteration. You got that, Gary? What is it?
Now, transliteration is you just take whatever is in the Greek or Hebrew and get the equivalent English character. So you spell it out in English characters, such as orphan. That's the Greek word for somebody without living parents. Orphan, orphanos. That we just take the Greek characters
And we turn it into an English word.
Oh, okay.
We turn it into an English word then?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting.
All right.
By the way, the Greek word for sandwich. Sandwich.
Sandwich. All right. Good work. Gary has kept up his Greek, unlike Greg. And have you kept your Greek up?
Yeah.
Oh, well, you're a good man.
What do you think
I have books that keep up my Greek for me. See, they invented this thing called the internet, and that's a great Greek resource. If you are looking for a free website, Bible Gateway. Bible Gateway is fantastic, and there'll be about 50 different English Bible translations on Bible Gateway. And if you are into this and you want to bookmark that, I use it every week, and it's a great, great resource. Just Bible, but different versions. Or if you're I meant to say one other thing. I used to hear this preacher say he was so dumb when he first became a preacher. His first sermon was the Book of Concordance. In the back of many Bibles are a concordance. And what that means is, if you can only remember one word out of a verse, the word is apple. I know that this verse says apple. There's a good chance that a concordance will help you find that verse. But now, forget the concordance in your Bible and go to Bible Gateway, and it'll find it for you in
Great search.
a
Great.
split second. I promise you I use it all the time. All right, anything else?
The other thought about Bible Gateway is it will give you an audible.
Oh, it does. It reads to you.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
reads to
I'd
you.
forgotten that.
Sounds good.
So if you are having visual issues like Mort, you can go to Bible Gateway and listen to the text. It's a great, great resource, and it has a good app for your phone too. There's a desktop and a phone app. Sometimes if I'm looking at my phone in church, it's like, oh yeah, what is that verse? I need to find that on Bible Gateway. Thank you for coming. I feel like you've kind of got to start. I'm introducing you to your Bible as if you had never met one before. Did anybody get a notebook? Did you want a notebook? Oh, well, we'll get you.